So let me paint a picture for you. It was 2019, I was 27 years old at the time, and I was addicted. Now, I wasn't hooked on pills or alcohol or anything like that. What I was addicted to was being cynical. It was this voice that had completely taken hold of the steering wheel in my life, and I saw it heading straight for a cliff. There's this thing called the 27 Club, and if you don't know what that is, all I can say is it's not a club that you want to be in. And I realized, hey, if I don't find a new lens to see my life through, I'm not going to make it to 28. And this book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, helped me to do that. It's one of my favorites. And in this video, I'm going to share with you 3 lessons that I took from the book that called me out on some of my BS and gave me firmer ground to stand on in the context of my own life. By the way, feel free to hit the notification bell and subscribe when the inspiration strikes. So let's take a minute first and let's steelman cynicism here, because it does have its utility. We start out with this default sense of optimism about the world. We have this monocular view that only allows us to see the joy and the laughter and the beauty in things. But inevitably, life has a way of ripping the rug out from under you. And at some point, your eyes are going to be open. And for the first time, you're going to see the other half of reality, that is suffering. This is where cynicism begins. We want to avoid that uncertainty and that vulnerability. And we figure the way to do that is to get rid of optimism, because that's what led us astray in the first place. So instead, we start building up this wall of distrust and disillusionment around ourselves to keep those dangers and the disappointments of our life out. But what ends up happening is most of us wind up living behind that wall for so long that we don't know how to live without it. And that's the problem. See, Frankl was a prisoner in the Nazi concentration camps during World War II. He was also a psychiatrist, and that inclined him to be an astute observer of human behavior. And he noticed something really interesting about his fellow prisoners in the camp. He says, prisoners who ceased to live for the future were the most likely to die first. Anything outside of the barbed wire became out of reach and unreal. Instead of taking the camp's difficulties as a test of their inner strength, they didn't take their life seriously, and they despised it as something of no consequence. Life for such people became meaningless. Now, all the prisoners were trying to do was to find some relief from the pain of the concentration camps by dissociating from it. But when they constructed that wall to keep the suffering of their reality out, they were simultaneously separating themselves from the impetus to live. That's what Frankl identified. Now, this is an extreme case. Most of us won't ever know the suffering of what it's like to actually be a prisoner of war, and I'm very thankful for that. But what I realized, this was the first lesson I learned, was that the same bitterness and disillusionment that was inhabiting those prisoners in the concentration camps was also inhabiting me. I had allowed myself to be convinced by this narrative that the universe is random and indifferent to you. There's no justice, no right or wrong, no recourse for anything. You can't trust anyone. All there is power. That was a big one. My interest versus your interest, and that's that. You know, nothing really matters. And those ideas had me in their grip. And in the process of reading this book, Frankl was pushing me up against the wall, that edifice that I had cobbled together of these loosely held preconceptions, and he called me out. I realized those ideas that I had been clinging to, that I thought were making me more objective and seem more insightful, were actually just an elaborate excuse to avoid the hard work of taking responsibility for my own life. And you know what? The book helped me realize the limit of that worldview, because as far as I can tell, the downfall of cynicism and nihilism is that it offers no arguments to validate the will to live. And that's really easy for us to overlook whenever we're surrounded by comfort and security. But when you're starving and you're freezing to death in a Nazi concentration camp and you're gasping for breath because you've got pneumonia, and you know that at any moment it could all end, you might start to think differently about your life. No one can take away your instinct to survive except for you. And that is the final conclusion of cynicism and nihilism. So the next question is, if cynicism is off the table and we know that's not going to work, then what will? What's the alternative? Well, Frankl's got some interesting ideas about that. He says the way in which a man accepts his fate and all the suffering that it entails, the way in which he takes up his cross, gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult of circumstances, to add a deeper meaning to his life. Now, this was huge. I had been operating under this false presumption that was causing me a lot of grief. Looking back, I had been chasing after this illusion that Frankl calls the tensionless state, this fantasy land where problems don't exist and we're free from our obligations and our responsibilities that tie us all down. It sounds awesome, but that's not how it works. You don't get to decide between suffering and not suffering in life. But you do get to decide what you're going to suffer for. And by embracing the difficulty and the setbacks and the discomforts of your life as a challenge, you actually grant yourself agency and you give yourself the opportunity to overcome them. It's the universe's way of reaching out its hand to pull you up out of your current circumstances and into your potential, your window of tolerance for the amount of adversity that you can endure starts to expand. And conversely, victimhood actually turns out to be the harder road, because now you've put yourself at the feet of fate and you've become the type of person that Frankl refers to as a plaything of circumstance. And this is the second takeaway that I got from reading Man's Search for Meaning. When you're facing these difficulties and these uncertainties in your life, you can ask yourself this question: am I a variable or am I a constant? Now, if you choose to be a variable, then your life becomes an endless stream of reactions to the changing conditions of the moment. But here's the thing: if we choose to be a constant, then we now get to define the terms of engagement between ourselves and reality. Regardless of the circumstances you find yourself in, you become the consistent force that operates on your own terms and your own principles. And when you look at it from that point of view, life starts to get a whole lot more interesting. Don't forget to share your thoughts down in the comments if what I'm saying is resonating with you. I'm very interested to know what you think about this book. So I think we've covered a lot of ground so far. I was stuck in this cynical and nihilistic place in my life, and Frankl sort of tapped me on the shoulder and reminded me that I had a choice to make in the matter. And it seemed like I had two options in front of me. On the one hand, I could always go back to being naive and blindly optimistic. It definitely feels better to live that way, put on the rose-colored glasses, but I knew that that was a dead end. And on the other hand, I guess I could continue to let cynicism have the upper hand in my life, which I knew wasn't working either. But there was a third option, and this is the third lesson that I took from reading Man's Search for Meaning. Listen to these words: everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. If you operate on the belief that life is worth living, then you inevitably have to wrestle with this reality of suffering that we all experience. And the path forward that I've found is to face reality squarely, absolutely. Acknowledge the risks and the hardships that life sends your way because they're real. And pretending they don't exist doesn't make them not real. But in the face of all that, I can still choose to have the courage to hope and to see the beauty in things and act in love despite the risks and the pitfalls that come my way. In fact, I'm optimistic now because I see those pitfalls for what they actually are. And now I can take them and integrate them into an organized and focused plan that I can use going forward, because ultimately that's what moves the needle of my life in the positive direction. It's an idea that I call conscientious optimism. And if you're interested in that, there's a video I made on it that you can click right here or down in the description if you want to check it out. So that was what I learned from reading Man's Search for Meaning. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay humble, and I'll see you in the next video.